Margaret Neilson stood in the Duke's morning room, with her hands folded so tightly the knuckles shone white, and told herself to breathe as though her jaw did not throb. Lady Neilson's ring had split the skin just inside her mouth less than an hour before, a bright private pain that tasted faintly of iron. By the time the steward opened the door and announced her in his neutral voice, she had swallowed blood, swallowed shame, and arranged her face into composure. "Miss Margaret Neilson, Your Grace." The man at the writing table did not rise at once. Lord Alistair Vale, Duke of Harrow, finished the line beneath his pen with exacting care, sanded it, and only then looked up. He was not old, perhaps 35, but grief had carved him with a hard hand, silver at his temples where dark hair ought to have remained untouched, hollows beneath his eyes, and a stillness so complete it felt less like calm than refusal. He had the broad shoulders of a cavalryman and the expression of a judge pronouncing sentence on himself. "Your references are respectable," he said. "Your circumstances are not my concern. You understand this is temporary." "Yes, Your Grace." He studied her the way one might study a cracked pane in winter, calculating whether it would hold. Margaret had long been called plain by Lady Neilson, and anyone eager to please her, yet plainness had never sat quite comfortably on her. Her hair was dark and uncompromisingly smooth, her face pale and fine-boned, her eyes large and grave enough to unsettle people when she forgot to lower them. She remembered and lowered them now. "You are to assist in lessons and household order in the nursery wing," he continued. "You will report to Mrs. Finch. You will not interfere in estate matters. You will not discuss family affairs below stairs. If you are unsuited, you will be dismissed." The list was efficient. So was his voice, low, level, cold enough to preserve a body. "I understand, Your Grace." A pause. Behind him the windows gave onto clipped lawns and the pale sweep of the east terrace, sun striking old stone that looked expensive and unforgiving. Harrow House was rich in everything except warmth. Even in the polished morning room there was an absence like a held breath. Portraits lined the walls, ancestors in velvet and armour and pearls. One large frame near the mantel had been draped in gauze, as if the household could not yet bear to look directly at it. The late Duchess, Margaret guessed. No one had spoken her name. At last he rang for the steward. "Show Miss Neilson to Mrs. Finch." Dismissed. Margaret curtsied, turned, and kept her spine straight until the door closed behind her. Only in the corridor did she allow herself one careful hand against her jaw. Her father would have told her not to waste pain on people who had not earned it. Her father had taught her to set columns of figures before she could pin up her own hair, had taught her French verbs by the kitchen fire and legal shorthand by candlelight after supper, had taught her that dignity was not grandeur but discipline. He had died of a winter fever 2 years ago, leaving her and his widow with less than anyone guessed. Lady Neilson had sold the horses first, then the silver, then the leased fields she had no right to gamble away. By spring she had lost nearly everything at cards to men who wore cologne to hide desperation. The debts came due in signatures and visits. Margaret had become one line in a settlement, temporary governess in a ducal household in exchange for delayed payment, a useful, educated stepdaughter sent where she might be worth more than she cost. Temporary, the Duke had said. At Harrow House, temporary meant unprotected. The nursery wing sat in the older part of the house where corridors narrowed and draughts found the seams in oak panelling. Mrs. Finch, stout and competent, greeted Margaret with practical kindness and frank eyes that missed little. "We keep to order where we can," she said, leading her toward the schoolroom. "Master Theo is 9 and hates Latin but loves maps. Lady Eliza is 7 and pretends she cannot read if she thinks it will make us fuss over her. They've had 3 governesses since last autumn." She pressed her lips together. "The children are not ill-behaved by nature. They are grieving and not allowed to speak of it." Margaret looked at the closed doors they passed, the silent maids, the footman who moved like a shadow with a tray no one touched. "Not allowed!" Mrs. Finch's mouth softened with pity. "No one said it plain, but one learns what not to name." The first week taught Margaret the shape of that silence. The children tested her with mischief that had desperation under it. Ink spilled deliberately, copybooks hidden, a frog in her work-basket, a shriek of laughter too sharp to be joy. Theo woke from nightmares and claimed he had simply heard thunder. Eliza asked, in a voice too casual, whether dead mothers could read invisible writing, then denied asking at all. Margaret set lessons like scaffolding, precise, patient, unyielding. They conjugated Aimer and passed Caesar and copied maps of Roman roads. She praised effort, not performance. When Theo flung his slate in fury at ablative absolutes, she made him pick it up, apologise to no one in particular, and begin again. When Eliza climbed under the table and refused to emerge, Margaret sat on the floor beside the table and read aloud from Plutarch until 2 small shoes appeared at the edge of shadow. The Duke appeared rarely and always unexpectedly, a tall figure in the doorway, as if summoned by unrest. He asked his son about fencing practice, his daughter about her scales, never about dreams or tears. The children stood straight in his presence and shrank at the same time. Margaret saw him once in the chapel alone after dusk, head bent, hands braced on the back of a pew, as though holding himself upright against weather no one else could feel. When she looked away quickly, he said, without turning, "You are not required here at this hour, Miss Neilson." "No, Your Grace." He did not say she might stay. She went. By June, Margaret had learned that Harrow House ran on exact timetables and unspoken wounds. Breakfast bells, riding hours, account ledgers, calls from neighbouring estates, music practice, physicians' visits for a cough that had lingered in the youngest kitchen maid for weeks. Routine everywhere, as if routine were mortar in a cracked wall. Then the storm came. It arrived in the heavy hot hush of late afternoon, when the sky turns yellow at the edges and even birds go quiet. Theo had begged to race the terrace before rain began. Margaret had allowed 1 turn, then 2, while Eliza watched from beneath the colonnade, counting aloud. Thunder rolled over the house, long and distant. A footman called from the doors that the children should come in. Theo laughed and ran harder. The first rain hit all at once, fat drops that darkened stone in blotches. Theo took the 3rd step too fast. His boots skidded. He pitched forward, struck shoulder and neck against the edge, and slid, frighteningly limp, to the bottom. "Eliza! Back!" Margaret said, already moving. By the time she reached him, rain sheeted down in silver ropes. Theo was on his side, eyes open but unfocused, mouth working without sound, not crying, not breathing properly. "Fetch Mr. Avery! Now!" shouted a footman from somewhere behind her. Another man yelled for the physician as if volume could conjure him through weather. Margaret dropped to her knees in pooling water. Panic came bright and cold, then narrowed into tasks. Her father's voice again, from years ago, beside a fallen farmhand. "Don't fear first. Observe first." Theo's chest hitched. His throat made a wet, choking noise. She rolled him gently, fingers steady despite the tremor in her own wrists, cleared mud and water from his mouth, angled him forward as another convulsive gasp seized him. "Come on," she murmured, rain soaking her cap, hair, collar. "Come on, Theodore, breathe for me." His body jerked once. He coughed, a harsh, tearing sound, and then another cough followed with air behind it. Real air. He began to cry in ragged little snarls of pain and outrage. "Good," Margaret said, almost laughing with relief, though she was shaking now hard enough to rattle her teeth. "That is very good." Hands closed in around them. Footman, Mrs. Finch, a groom with a blanket. Someone lifted Theo. Eliza sobbed into Margaret's sleeve. Thunder cracked directly overhead. When Margaret looked up, the Duke stood at the top of the steps, bareheaded in the rain, water running down his face, unnoticed. He did not shout, he did not rush, but his eyes were fixed on his son with an intensity that made the air around him seem charged. Theo was carried inside. Eliza clung to Margaret until Mrs. Finch took her. Only when the courtyard emptied did Margaret become aware she was still kneeling in storm water with gravel embedded in her palms. "Miss Neilson!" The Duke's voice, close now, she got to her feet unsteadily. "Your Grace, if I exceeded my position, I beg—" "You will remain." 3 words, flat as law. He held her gaze 1 heartbeat longer than propriety demanded, as if searching for something in her face he did not expect to find. Then he turned and followed his son indoors. Margaret stood in the rain until a maid tugged her sleeve and whispered, "Miss, you're soaked through," as if that were the alarming part. Theo recovered by evening with bruises, a strained neck, and an appetite fierce enough to terrify Mrs. Finch with gratitude. The physician praised Providence and stout constitutions. Margaret expected censure for touching a peer's child without instruction, expected dismissal delayed only by crisis. Instead, her room remained hers. Her duties expanded quietly. The next morning there was fresh paper in the schoolroom cupboard, and no explanation. The Duke did not thank her. He merely began to appear more often, never interrupting, watching from thresholds with that same unreadable expression, as if she were a cipher he disliked having to solve. It was Theo, a week later, who opened the door to what came next. "Do you think Mamma knows I fell?" he asked abruptly while blotting ink on an essay about Hannibal. His tone was matter-of-fact, his ears pink with the effort of pretending it was an idle question. Margaret set down her own pen. Eliza, at the far table, went very still. "I don't know what the dead know," Margaret said after a moment, "but I know we remember them poorly if we speak to them never." Theo scowled at the page. "Papa doesn't speak." "No," Margaret said, "not allowed." That night, after prayers, she found the children lingering in the old, disused schoolroom at the end of the corridor, the one with a cracked globe and a chimney that smoked in damp weather. Eliza held a ribbon box with both hands, like an offering. "We thought," Eliza said to the floor, "maybe we could tell Mamma things and not make a fuss." Margaret looked at the child's small, rigid shoulders and felt something in her chest give way. "Not a fuss," she agreed. "A record." They wrote the first note together on half sheets. Theo dictated and crossed things out. "Today I did not cry when it stormed." Eliza added in cramped letters, "I practiced C major and hated it." Margaret, at their insistence, wrote 1 line of her own at the bottom. They were brave and ordinary, both. She sealed the pages, tied them with blue thread, and placed them in a painted blue box she found in a cabinet of broken slates. The ritual grew by increments. Some nights there was nothing to write. Other nights there were scraped knees, French verbs mastered, fears admitted in code. Margaret kept the language plain, never sentimental, always practical. Loss, she had learned, could be borne if given structure. The children slept better. Theo's nightmares came fewer nights. Eliza laughed once at breakfast and looked startled by the sound. Harrow House, however, was not a place where quiet improvements stayed private for long. The first letter disappeared in July. Margaret noticed because the ribbon in the box was untied differently than she had left it. She said nothing, told herself perhaps Theo had looked and forgotten to mention it. Yet she caught two maids whispering when she entered a passage and stopping too quickly. At dinner, the Duke's gaze passed over her and away like a shutter dropped. 2 days later, Lady Neilson arrived at Harrow House in a carriage trimmed with ribbons she could not afford. She descended smiling, all cream silk and rosewater and calculated maternal affection. "My dear Margaret," she cried in the hall loud enough for 3 footmen and a housemaid to hear, "how fortunate you are to have found such elevated employment." Margaret felt old dread settle under her ribs. "Lady Neilson, I was not told to expect you." "Of course not. Surprises are the soul of family tenderness." Her stepmother's fingers tightened briefly on Margaret's arm, nails biting through muslin. Her smile never shifted. "We must speak privately at once." In Margaret's small sitting room, Lady Neilson dropped the smile like a fan snapping shut. "Well," she said, "what have you secured?" "I have secured a position," Margaret answered. "Nothing more." "Don't be pious with me." Lady Neilson prowled to the window, evaluating curtains, silver, distance to power. "You are under a duke's roof. He keeps you on after heroics in the rain. Servants are already talking. You can do better than grammar lessons." Margaret's jaw tightened where the old bruise had barely faded. "I will not discuss this." "You will, because Mr. Calthorpe has renewed his claim." The name landed like a slap. A creditor with damp hands and an eye for frightened girls. "He is willing to accept marriage in place of cash if payment is delayed further. I have done what I can, but my resources are strained." "You have gambled them," Margaret thought, and kept her face still. Lady Neilson leaned close, breath sweet and rancid beneath perfume. "If you fail to earn your keep, child, I can still place you where debt demands. Do not mistake your books for protection." When she had gone, Margaret sat very straight in the hard chair and counted backward in French until the shaking in her hands ceased. Over the next week, Lady Neilson extended her visit under pretence of weak nerves and country air. She praised the house to its owners and poisoned it below stairs. Margaret heard the rumours by indirection first. Broken conversations, widened eyes, a valet abruptly remembering urgent duties when she approached. Then, more plainly from Mrs. Finch, furious and embarrassed. "She says you angle to replace what's gone," Mrs. Finch muttered in the linen room, folding sheets with savage precision. "Says no woman writes letters in secret unless she means to snare sympathy." Margaret went cold. "She has spoken of the letters." "Not openly. Enough to foul ears." That afternoon, in the schoolroom, Lady Neilson made her move in front of the children. She stood by the map table, gloved fingertips resting on Theo's exercise book, as if it were contaminated. "Really, Margaret," she said in a voice bright with contempt, "must every scraped knee become an elegy? These little brats have learned tears purchase attention. It is poor training for rank." Theo's face went white with fury. Eliza ducked her head, shoulders curling inward. Margaret set down her pen with exquisite care. She lifted her eyes fully, forgetting for once to lower them. "Grief in children is not theatre, madam," she said, each word precise as cut glass, "and neither is cruelty." Silence snapped across the room. Lady Neilson flushed, then smiled thinly. "How very improved you are." When she swept out, her skirts hissed over the threshold like a warning. That evening the Duke requested Margaret in the morning room. She stood where she had stood on her first day, feeling again the old ache in her jaw, though the bruise was gone. "I am told there has been discord," he said. "Your Grace, if there is discord, it is not of the children's making." His expression did not alter. "You keep private papers in the schoolroom." Margaret's breath caught. "Yes." "Concerning my household." "Yes, Your Grace." "For what purpose?" She could have lied, said lesson notes only, said inventories. Instead, she heard Theo asking whether his mother knew he had fallen, saw Eliza clutching the ribbon box like a life raft. "To give the children somewhere to place what they cannot say at table," she answered, "and to keep a true account of their days." His gaze sharpened. "An account for whom?" "For your dead wife. For you when you can bear to read it. For a house that mistakes silence for strength." "For posterity," Margaret said at last, because it was the safest fraction of truth. The Duke's mouth hardened almost imperceptibly. "You will submit all nursery records to Mrs. Finch henceforth." A dismissal would have been cleaner. This was worse. Scrutiny, suspicion, and the slow tightening of walls. Margaret curtsied and withdrew, pulse loud in her ears. In her room she opened her father's old pocket ledger, the one possession she had carried from home, and ran her fingers over the neat shorthand symbols he had taught her. Assets, liabilities, risk. If she lost this place, Lady Neilson would hand her to Calthorpe. If she stayed under rumour, she endangered the children's fragile trust. If she defended herself too fiercely, society would call it ambition. If she yielded, it would call it confession. Down the corridor, a child laughed in brief surprise. From farther away came the muted stroke of the dinner gong. Harrow House moved through its rituals, stately and precise, while beneath them fault lines shifted. Margaret dipped her pen in ink, drew a clean line across fresh paper, and began the night's letter in small, steady script. "Today we endured thunder again. No one drowned, no one broke. That is not nothing." A blot of ink gathered at the tail of nothing, and Margaret steadied her hand before it spread. She let the line dry, folded the sheet, and sanded it with care she did not feel. Outside her door, footsteps passed, quick, then slower, then quick again, the household's nervous pulse made audible. She had just sealed the page when there came a small, decisive knock. Not a servant, not Mrs. Finch. Eliza always knocked as if announcing herself to fate. "Come in," Margaret said. Eliza slipped through the door in her night-rail, hair in two uneven braids, face set in the solemnity she wore when afraid. She held a wooden horse, Theo's, not hers, gripped by one leg. "I did not laugh at supper," she blurted. "I know I did this morning, but I did not at supper because Papa looked tired, and I thought if I laughed it would be unkind." Margaret crouched so they were eye level. "Kindness is not the same as silence, Eliza." Eliza's chin trembled. "Then why does everyone go quiet when Mamma is in the room, without being in the room?" The question struck so cleanly, Margaret had to inhale once before answering. "Because grown people are often cowards in very polished clothing," she said softly. "And because they think names are knives." Eliza considered this, then thrust the horse at her. "Put this in the box. Theo said Mamma will know it means he was brave and didn't cry at fencing when Mr. Bell made him bleed." Margaret took the toy as if it were porcelain. "I will." Eliza relaxed by a fraction. At the door she paused. "Will you still be here when leaves go yellow?" Margaret forced herself not to answer quickly. Children heard promises as vows. "I am here tonight," she said, "and tomorrow morning you still have ablative absolutes." Eliza made a face of comic despair and vanished. When Margaret returned to her desk, the sealed letter seemed heavier. She added one postscript beneath the fold. "Lady Eliza asks practical questions no one else will answer. Master Theo bleeds and calls it weather." She blew out the candle and sat in darkness until the wick cooled, listening to Harrow House breathe. The next morning broke with too much brightness, all windows and polished silver and voices pitched one note too high. Lady Neilson had elected to breakfast in the small family dining room, a favour no one had requested, and no one dared decline. She wore pale yellow and indignation. "Country butter is always so earnest," she said, pushing away her plate untouched. "One cannot fault earnestness, I suppose. It has become very fashionable." Theo dropped his spoon with a clatter. Eliza stared at her porridge as if it might save her. The Duke entered late, coat immaculate, expression unreadable. Margaret rose with the others. His gaze skimmed the table, paused for one heartbeat on Lady Neilson, then moved on to Margaret with no sign of recognition beyond protocol. "Your Grace," Lady Neilson purred, all sugar now. "I was just saying Miss Neilson has brought such feeling to the nursery. The children are almost theatrical." Margaret felt Theo go rigid beside her chair. The Duke unfolded his napkin. "Children are not my guests, Lady Neilson. They are not required to entertain." A rebuke, mild but unmistakable. Lady Neilson laughed as though he had made a clever joke and reached for marmalade. After breakfast, the Duke asked Margaret to remain. Theo looked from one to the other, mutinous. "Must she?" "Yes," his father said. When the children had gone out with Mrs. Finch, silence settled like dust. The Duke stood by the window, backlit, so his face was half shadow. "From today," he said, "you will conduct lessons only in the main schoolroom during appointed hours. No evening gatherings in disused rooms, no private keepsakes." Margaret kept her hands still at her sides. "The evening gatherings were for reading and prayers." "They will occur in the nursery parlour with doors open." Something in his tone, not louder, not sharper, but closed, told her this was not merely an order. It was a verdict reached elsewhere. "Am I accused of impropriety, Your Grace?" His jaw moved once. "You are not accused. You are instructed." "On what grounds?" He turned then, and she saw fatigue under the cold. Fatigue and anger pointed at the wrong target, because the right one was dead or impossible. "On the grounds," he said quietly, "that my house has become a nest of whispers, and I will not have my children used as instruments in anyone's campaign." The words landed with such precision she knew he believed them. Margaret thought of the missing letter, of gossip seeded like burrs in wool, of Lady Neilson's soft venom in hallways. She could defend herself, name her stepmother plainly, and watch him hear ambition in every syllable, or she could bow and preserve at least the children's daily structure. "As you wish, Your Grace," she curtsied. He did not dismiss her at once. For a moment she thought he might ask something else, about Eliza's sleep, Theo's headaches, the map exercises. Instead he said only, "Mrs. Finch will hold the schoolroom key at night." When Margaret reached the corridor, Lady Neilson waited near a console table, pretending to admire a Chinese vase. "Well?" she asked without moving her lips. "He has changed nursery routines." Lady Neilson's smile was all teeth. "Excellent! Pressure reveals character. Yours remains disappointingly moral." Margaret walked past her. "Do not be foolish, child," Lady Neilson said lightly behind her. "A closed door today is merely leverage tomorrow." The days that followed narrowed. Lessons continued, but with observers drifting in and out on invented errands. A footman adjusting curtains twice in 1 hour. A maid polishing a grate already polished. Lady Neilson appearing with sugared almonds for children she called undisciplined when no one watched. Theo grew sharp-tongued and reckless, baiting his tutors, daring punishment. Eliza returned to old habits of vanishing beneath furniture and refusing eye contact. At night, without the blue box ritual, fears went feral. Theo resumed waking from nightmares and denying them. Eliza began wetting the bed, then weeping in shame before dawn, so no one would see. Margaret petitioned Mrs. Finch for permission to continue the letters under supervision. Mrs. Finch looked stricken. If it were my say, yes, but His Grace has been explicit. Then speak to him. I have. He said structure must be visible. She lowered her voice. He is not himself, Miss Neilson. He thinks enemies where there are wounds. On Thursday, Lady Neilson cornered Margaret in the library alcove between theology and county histories, where no one passed at that hour. I received Mr. Calthorpe's man this morning, she said conversationally, trailing one gloved finger along calfskin bindings. He grows impatient. I reminded him you are in an advantageous house. He was most interested. Margaret felt heat rise, then recede into a colder steadiness. Do not discuss me with him. My dear, I discuss assets with creditors. It is practically bookkeeping. Lady Neilson turned, eyes bright with malice. Unless you prefer he come fetch you himself, imagine the scene on these elegant steps. Margaret's voice dropped. If you harm those children with your schemes, I will speak. To whom? The Duke, who already suspects your little devotions. Lady Neilson laughed softly. You should have secured affection before revealing your principles. Men forgive ambition in silk, not in plain muslin. She swept away, leaving rosewater and threat. That evening Theo refused supper and barricaded himself in the map room. The Duke, summoned from estate business, found him there with torn atlases underfoot and a brass divider clenched in his fist like a weapon. I hate this house, Theo shouted hoarsely. I hate quiet. I hate everyone saying, improve yourself when... His voice cracked. He hurled the divider. It struck the wainscoting near Margaret's shoulder and dropped with a metallic ring. The Duke went very still. You will apologise to Miss Neilson. No, now. Theo's chest heaved. You sent her away. You sent Mama away, and now you sent... He stopped, horror at his own words flooding his face too late. The Duke flinched as if struck. For one naked second, grief cracked the ice clean through. Then the mask returned. Go to your room, he said. Theo bolted, knocking past Margaret so hard her arm hit the doorframe. The Duke did not look at her. Leave us, he told the hovering footman. When they were alone, he stared at the torn maps without seeing them. Margaret waited, unsure whether she was dismissed. At last he said, rougher than she had ever heard him, You should not have been present. I am often present when children break, Margaret answered, then wished she had chosen gentler words. His gaze snapped to hers, wounded and furious. And do you mend them all, Miss Neilson? No, I sit with them until they can breathe. Silence expanded. If you cannot tolerate their grief, she said quietly, they will make it louder until you must. Colour rose high in his cheekbones, anger, shame, she could not tell. You presume greatly for a temporary employee. I do, she said, because temporary or not, they are not temporary children. She expected immediate dismissal. Instead, he turned away, one hand braced on the mantel, and said, without looking at her, You may go. By morning, she was formally removed from night duties. The order came in writing through the steward. Miss Neilson's responsibilities are confined to academic instruction, penmanship, and supervised recreation. No after-supper attendance required. No after-supper attendance permitted. Margaret read the note once, folded it, and put it in her pocket ledger with her father's shorthand. Her throat burned, but her face remained composed when Eliza asked at tea, Are you cross with us? Never with you, Margaret said. Then why don't you come when it's dark? Because grown people make poor decisions before bed, Theo muttered, and kicked the leg of his chair. Rain returned 2 nights later, softer than the storm that had nearly taken Theo, but persistent, drumming on slates and filling gutters. Without night duties, Margaret should have gone to her room after dinner. Instead, she sat in the records closet, off the west gallery, with estate rent rolls spread across a crate, transcribing arrears for Mr. Halbrook, the solicitor, at Mrs. Finch's request. Numbers steadied her when people did not. Near 10 o'clock, she realised she lacked the Norfolk map needed to verify a boundary note. Mrs. Finch had mentioned old duplicates in the disused schoolroom cabinet. Margaret hesitated, hearing the Duke's order in her head, then told herself this was estate work, not ritual. She took a candle and went. The disused schoolroom smelled of cold ash and chalk. Chairs stood stacked against one wall. The cracked globe leaned drunkenly in its stand. In the far cabinet, she found map tubes tied with twine. She also found, shoved behind them, the painted blue box. For a moment she simply stared. She had moved it weeks ago to a hidden shelf in the nursery linen press after noticing the tampered ribbon. Someone had moved it again, or found the second place and returned it here as a message. Her pulse thudded. She set down the candle, lifted the lid, and counted quickly. Not all there. Several early letters missing. The door clicked behind her. She turned so fast wax spattered her wrist. The Duke stood in the threshold, coat off, sleeves rolled, hair damp as if he had come in from the rain. He looked from her face to the open box and back again. In his hand was a bundle of estate parchments. For one suspended instant, neither spoke. Then he said, very controlled, "So it is true." Margaret straightened. "What do you believe is true, Your Grace?" "That my instructions were ignored, that my children's private grief is being curated in secret, that papers concerning my household are hidden in disused rooms." "Hidden," she repeated, because fury had finally burned through fear, "after they were disturbed. By whom? You tell me. I do not have keys to every corridor." He stepped into the room, shut the door with deliberate care, and crossed to the table. He set down his parchments beside the box, jaw hard. "You will leave this with me." "No." The word escaped before Prudence could net it. His eyes flashed. "No," he echoed. Margaret heard the precipice under them both, and took one breath, then another. "Your Grace, those notes belong first to 2 children who trusted there would be one place in this house where their mother could still be addressed without punishment." "Punishment!" His voice went cold enough to frost glass. "You accuse me now of punishing my own children." "I accuse this house of mistaking silence for discipline," she said, and lifted her chin. "Including you, especially you." He stared at her, thunder muttering distantly in the eaves. Then, with a movement almost weary, he reached past her, took the box and opened the top packet. Margaret should have stopped him. She did not. It was too late for half measures. He read the first page standing. Then he sat as if his knees had given way and read another and another. Rain marked time at the windows. His face changed by degrees she would not have believed if she had not seen them. Suspicion to confusion, confusion to something like pain stripped of armour. He turned to one written in Theo's blocky hand, corrected in her smaller script. "Today I did not cry when Belle said, 'again,' 7 times, and my arms shook. Eliza cried because of sums, and I did not call her stupid. Papa ate bread at supper and did not leave before pudding. This is progress." Another, in Eliza's ink. "I played C major without hating it all the way through. Papa stood by the door and listened, though he said he came for his gloves. Theo says gloves do not take that long." Then one of Margaret's brief additions. "Your son asks for harder maps when he is frightened. Your daughter asks impossible questions when she is brave." Their father sat by Theo's fever until dawn and believed no one saw. His hand tightened on the page. At length he closed the box and spoke without looking up. "There are no appeals for favour. No, Your Grace. No self-pity. No. Performance." The last word was almost to himself. Margaret said nothing. He rose abruptly and left the room. She stood alone, trembling now with reaction, and thought, "It is done. Either I am dismissed by morning, or something has cracked that cannot be resealed." She gathered the map tubes with mechanical care and returned to the records closet. An hour later, as she was blotting the final column, a liveried footman appeared at the door. "His Grace requests Miss Neilson in the study. At once." The study was lit by 2 lamps and a low fire, though the night was warm. The Duke stood behind his desk, one hand on the back of his chair. On the blotter before him lay a different stack of letters, tied in black ribbon, gone frayed at the edges. Margaret recognised widowhood in the very posture of them. He did not ask her to sit. "I wrote to my wife after she died," he said, voice flat from restraint. "For nearly a year. I kept them locked because I was ashamed of what I said when no one could answer." He untied the ribbon and pushed the top sheet toward her. She did not read the words, only enough to see the dark pressure of his hand and the repeated terrible pronoun, "you." "I blamed her," he said, "for leaving, for the children's tears, for every decision I did not want to make alone. I called it honesty." He gave a humourless breath that was not a laugh. "It was rage dressed as devotion." Margaret looked up, slowly. He met her gaze. In his eyes was no ice now, only exhaustion and a raw astonishment that seemed to frighten him more than anger had. "Your letters," he said, touching the blue box, now set beside the black ribbon bundle, "are kinder than mine." The confession hung between them, intimate as prayer. At last he asked, quieter, "Why did you write them, Miss Neilson? Truly?" She answered as she had wished to answer the first time. "Because children need to speak to their mother somewhere," she said, "and because one day they will ask what sort of father they had in these years. I wanted there to be a record that you tried, not only that you endured." Something in his face gave way then, not collapse, but yielding. He sank into the chair as if suddenly aware of gravity. "I have been unfair to you." "Yes," Margaret said, because false modesty would insult them both. A short breath escaped him, almost surprised. "You might have chosen a safer employer." "I did not have that luxury." "No." He looked at the fire, then back at her. "Nor perhaps did I." Silence again, but altered now, not absence, rather space being made. He straightened. "You will resume evening prayers and reading with the children. If you wish to continue the letters, you will do so openly, with my knowledge." Margaret felt caution rise instinctively. "Lady Neilson will call that sanction." "Lady Neilson," he said, and there was steel under the fatigue, "has enjoyed my hospitality beyond reason. I will manage her." It was not yet a promise of victory, but it was the first statement of intent she had heard from him that was not merely defensive. She inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace." As she turned to go, he said, "Margaret." The use of her given name stopped her at the door. He seemed to realise it only after speaking, but did not retract it. "The line about the fever," he said. "I did sit there. I thought no one noticed." "I noticed," she replied. Their eyes met in the lamplight, his guarded, hers steady, and something passed between them that neither named because naming would make it dangerous. When she left the study, the corridor felt the same and not the same. Oak panels, runner carpets, distant rain. Yet somewhere behind her, in the Duke's private rooms, lay 2 bundles of letters, one black-ribboned, one blue, and the house had shifted by an inch that might, in time, become a mile. By breakfast, the inch had been noticed. Not by the children first. They noticed only that Margaret returned after supper with a candle and a stack of books, and that their father sat with them through one chapter of Plutarch without pretending he had lost his gloves. It was Lady Neilson who noticed the true shift. The Duke speaking Margaret's name without visible irritation, Mrs. Finch no longer intercepting every nursery request, the old pattern of cold suspicion no longer cleanly available for manipulation. She watched all morning with the bright stillness of a cat near a dovecote. At 11 she intercepted Margaret in the blue drawing-room, where vases waited for flowers that had not yet been cut. "My poor dear," she said sweetly, "how swiftly one rises in a house starved for tenderness." Margaret did not stop walking. "If you require anything, ask Mrs. Finch." "Oh, I require very little, only amusement and liquidity." Lady Neilson's voice dropped. "Shall we speak plainly now that his Grace has thawed?" Margaret turned then, because not turning would be read as fear. "We have never once spoken plainly, madam," Lady Neilson smiled. "Then permit me to begin." From her reticule she drew a folded page, held just far enough away that Margaret saw the familiar paper and the child's uneven hand before Lady Neilson tucked it back. Theo's writing, one of the early letters. For a second Margaret's composure fractured into pure, hot panic. "Where did you get that?" "Questions are expensive." Lady Neilson adjusted her glove. "Mr. Calthorpe's patience is exhausted. My own creditors are vulgar. You will procure £5,000, or I shall assume the Duke prefers honesty in public." "You are blackmailing me with a child's grief." "I am blackmailing a household with appetites for reputation." Lady Neilson tilted her head. "Do keep the terms accurate." Margaret's voice went flat. "I cannot access £5,000. "No? Pity. Then perhaps his Grace can, unless he dislikes paying for the preservation of his late wife's dignity." Her smile sharpened. "And his own? I have seen documents with his signature that would interest a magistrate." Margaret went still. "What documents?" "Promissory notes, debts, dates. Men become careless when bereaved." She let the words linger, then stepped back toward the door. 3 days, child. We are hosting a musicale Friday. Such a useful crowd for truth." When she had gone, Margaret remained exactly where she was until the trembling left her knees. 3 days. At luncheon, Lady Neilson was all gracious chatter. She praised Harrow Claret, asked after neighbouring estates, and suggested, lightly, graciously, that the house had felt so subdued for so long, surely a small musicale would restore spirits. Before anyone could decline, she had named possible guests. Mrs. Finch dropped a spoon. The Duke looked at Lady Neilson with a long, unreadable expression, and said only, "If invitations are sent, they go through the steward." Lady Neilson lowered her lashes. "Naturally." By evening the first notes had already gone out. Margaret told him that night. Not in the corridor, not in passing. In the study with the door shut, the fire low, and the blue box between them like evidence in a trial. She repeated Lady Neilson's demand word for word, then added the part that mattered most. "She has one of Theo's letters," Margaret said. "Perhaps more. And she claims to possess promissory notes with your signature." The Duke's face did not change, but the knuckles of his left hand whitened on the desk edge. "Why did you not tell me at once this morning?" "Because I wanted certainty before I added danger." "You had certainty when she named an amount?" "Yes." Margaret met his gaze. "And I am telling you now." He rang for a footman and sent for Halbrook, the estate's solicitor, with instructions marked urgent. Mr. Halbrook arrived near midnight, hair disordered, waistcoat hastily buttoned, leather case tucked under his arm. He listened with professional stillness, then began asking questions in clipped sequence. Who had seen the paper, whether Lady Neilson had named witnesses, whether any true debt to her remained outstanding from the late Mr. Neilson's estate. Some lawful settlement exists, Halbrook said at last, rubbing his brow. Not 5,000, not close. If she claims forged paper under your Grace's name, that is criminal exposure, but... He looked between them. If we remove her tonight and she has lodged copies elsewhere, she may trigger scandal anyway. Extortioners rarely carry only one knife. The Duke's voice was iron. Then we take all of them. With respect, sir, we may not know where all is. By 1 a.m. they had a plan. Lady Neilson would be confronted at breakfast with a lawful debt settlement, instructed to depart by noon, and warned that any attempt to circulate private papers would be prosecuted. Halbrook would place discreet inquiries with the postmaster and local stationer to intercept packets not yet dispatched. Margaret would secure the nursery papers and keep the children close. A plan made of reason, law, and urgency. It failed before breakfast ended. Lady Neilson received the settlement figures with bored amusement, accepted the purse for the lawful amount, and set it aside untouched. "You mistake me, gentlemen," she said, buttering toast. "I am not bargaining for debt. I am safeguarding dignity." The Duke set down his cup. "You will leave this house today." "Gladly," she said, "if I am escorted to my carriage with courtesy and no discussion of legal threats." Her gaze drifted to Margaret. "Because unpleasantly abrupt departures activate instructions." Halbrook went very still. "What instructions?" Lady Neilson smiled. "A sealed packet with Mrs. Davenant in the village, another with my banker's clerk in town, to be opened if I am turned out under accusation. People are so obliging when one writes to be delivered in the event of my mistreatment." The Duke's voice dropped. "What is in them?" "Copies, excerpts, a touching letter in a little boy's hand, and notes bearing your signature. Whether authentic hardly matters once ladies begin repeating details over tea." Margaret felt the room tilt. Halbrook swore softly under his breath. Lady Neilson dabbed her mouth with her napkin. "Also, as I took the liberty of arranging Friday's musical, invitations are already accepted. Cancel now and everyone asks why. Proceed and we may all enjoy civility." After she left the table, no one spoke for a long moment. Halbrook broke first. "If she has indeed seeded packets, immediate force worsens risk. We need proof of forgery before public accusation. Without it, she controls the narrative." The Duke stared at the untouched toast on Lady Neilson's plate, as though it had insulted him. "And while we gather proof—" "We contain damage," Halbrook said grimly. "No private scenes, no visible rupture, no further material accessible to her. We endure 48 hours. Endure, the old verb, back like a sentence. By noon, the household had been instructed to prepare for guests. Musicians were contacted. Silver was counted. Fresh flowers arrived by cart. And Margaret was told, gently by Mrs. Finch, formally by the steward, that for the duration of company she should keep to strictly professional duties, avoid unnecessary appearances beside his Grace, and receive no private callers. Protection in the language of rank. Distance in practice. The cost landed hardest with the children. At evening reading, Theo looked from Margaret to his father's empty chair and scowled. "Did I do something wrong again?" "No," Margaret said. "Then why is everything polite?" Eliza whispered, as if the word itself were dangerous. Margaret had no answer that would not recruit them into adult warfare. She read from Plutarch with a steady voice, while Theo picked at a loose thread in the carpet until it frayed. When prayers were done, he lingered by the blue box and said, without looking up, "If someone steals things from it, maybe we should burn it." Margaret's throat closed. "We don't burn records because someone lies about them." He kicked the table leg once and fled. Alistair did not sleep. He dismissed his valet near 2, sat alone in his dressing room with a single lamp, and untied the black ribbon from the old stack of letters he had once believed were proof of devotion. The pages smelled faintly of dust and iron gall and the stubbornness of younger grief. He read until the words blurred. "You left me with everything. You do not know what he asks at night. You were always kinder than I was, and now I am punished for it." At the bottom of one page, written in a hand so hard the nib had scored through, he had once pressed the sentence, "I will not beg ghosts." He shut his eyes and saw Helena as she had been the week before fever took her, standing in the nursery doorway, hair unpinned, laughing at Theo's dramatic recitation of Latin endings, saying, "If I die first, promise me they won't grow up in a mausoleum." He had kissed her fingers and told her not to be morbid. He had built the mausoleum anyway, not in stone, in rules, in silence, in rooms where no one said her name because saying it made his own chest feel flayed open. He had called it dignity because he did not know what else to call fear. And now Margaret Neilson, plain-spoken, dangerous in her honesty, too young to carry the burdens already strapped to her, had walked into that mausoleum and opened windows, and he had punished her for the draught. He rose abruptly and crossed to the small writing table by the window. Rain had stopped. Moonlight lay along the terrace stones where Theo had fallen. Alistair braced his hands on the wood and let the truth arrive without ornament. He wanted her, not as consolation, not as a replacement for the dead. Wanted her mind in his rooms, her unflinching gaze across his desk, her voice in the spaces where he had trained everyone to whisper. Wanted with a ferocity that frightened him the future implied by her presence. And because he wanted it, he could destroy it. If Lady Neilson struck publicly, Margaret would carry the filth of it first. A duke could weather scandal. A governess turned dependent could be socially erased in a season. He could pay, threaten, litigate, but every move made her more visible as target. Every kindness could be recast as appetite. Every defence could be named admission. He had thought control was safety. It was merely delay. A soft knock came, not a servant's pattern. Mrs. Finch entered at his permission, robe over her nightdress, face pale. "Your Grace, forgive the hour. Master Theo is awake and refuses his draught. He says he wants you, but when I went in, he pretended to be asleep." Alistair almost laughed at the precision of the boy's contradiction. "I'll come." At Theo's bedside, in the candlelit half-dark, the child kept his eyes squeezed shut until Alistair sat. Then one eye cracked open. "Are you angry?" Theo whispered. "Yes," Alistair said honestly, "but not at you." Theo stared at the coverlet. "Is Miss Neilson leaving?" The question hit where armour never held. "I'm trying to ensure she does not," Alistair said. Theo nodded, as if filing tactical information, then rolled closer and muttered, "Don't do it the bad way this time." Alistair swallowed. "What is the bad way?" "Quiet," Theo said, already drifting. "Quiet is the bad way." When the boy slept, Alistair remained in the chair until dawn touched the curtains. He watched his son breathe and understood, with belated and unsparing clarity, that love required visibility. Hidden mercy did not protect children. Hidden feeling did not protect women. Hidden grief did not honour the dead. By breakfast he looked 10 years older and oddly more alive. Friday arrived under a high white sky and the sensation of a house holding its breath. From morning onward, Harrow House transformed into performance. Chairs shifted in the music room, candelabra polished, pianoforte tuned, cookmaids running with trays, footmen rehearsing routes as if choreography might prevent disaster. Lady Neilson moved through it all in lilac silk, gracious and tireless, greeting every task as though she were mistress of the place. At 11, she sent Margaret a note folded into thirds and delivered by an undermaid with frightened eyes. "My dear child," it read in flowing hand, "by 4 o'clock I require either A, a draft of £5,000, or B, your written agreement to accept Mr. Calthorpe's offer and withdraw from Harrow House before Michaelmas. Failing this, I shall assume candour is preferred and present my papers this evening to suitable witnesses. Do dress plainly. Sincerity plays best in wool." Margaret read it twice, then burned it over her candle and watched the ash collapse. She took her father's pocket ledger from the drawer and opened to the back pages where he had taught her to mark irregularities. Impossible dates, inconsistent witnesses, signatures copied from older instruments. If Lady Neilson truly held forged notes, there would be seams. There were always seams. At noon she found Halbrook in the records room bent over account books. "I need every genuine signature His Grace has made in the last 3 years, she said. He blinked. "That is a substantial request." "So is prison." Within an hour they had a stack: rent directives, tenant remissions, 2 parliamentary correspondences, 1 hunting subscription. Margaret compared flourishes, pressure, slant, ink spread. She built, line by line, the argument she would need if forced to speak where rank would rather she remained decorative. At 3 the Duke came to the doorway. He looked at the papers, then at her ink-stained fingers, and for a second his composure wavered into something like grief mixed with admiration. "I should forbid this," he said quietly. "You should let me survive it," she answered. He stepped inside, lowered his voice. "If she moves tonight, she will try to isolate you, make you answer before I can intervene." "Then don't intervene first," Margaret said. "Let me answer." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what they will call you?" "Yes." "And still?" She held his gaze. "Still?" A beat. Then he nodded once, as if accepting a military plan he hated. At 5:30, the first carriages rolled into the forecourt. Lanterns were lit early. Music folios were arranged. Ladies in satin and pearls drifted through the receiving rooms, trailing scent and speculation. Men bowed, assessed, and pretended not to assess. The air glittered with varnish and danger. Margaret stood near the back of the music room in dark grey silk, plain as instructed by no one she respected, with Mrs. Finch beside her and the blue box locked in the schoolroom cupboard under Halbrook's seal. Theo and Eliza had been sent upstairs after a brief greeting, furious at exile. From across the room, Lady Neilson caught Margaret's eye and smiled, as if sharing a private joke. Then the steward approached the Duke, bent to murmur and visibly paled at whatever answer he received. A minute later, he came straight to Margaret. "Miss Neilson," he said, voice low and strained, "Lady Neilson requests your presence in the small withdrawing salon, immediately. She has asked Mrs. Fenwick and Lady Trowbridge to attend as witnesses to a clarification. 2 magistrates' wives, exactly the sort who carried news farther than post." Across the room Alistair had already turned toward them, expression carved from stone and fury. Margaret felt fear rise, clean and cold, and settle into place like a blade being sheathed. "Very well," she said. She placed her father's ledger under her arm, lifted her chin and walked toward the salon doors as the first violin began to tune. The first violin's A-note thinned through the corridor like wire as Margaret stepped into the small withdrawing salon. Lady Neilson stood before the hearth, lilac silk arranged as though painted, a folded packet in one hand and Theo's stolen letter in the other. Mrs. Fenwick and Lady Trowbridge sat together on a settee, fans idle in their laps, expressions sharpened by the scent of impropriety. Near the escritoire stood Mr. Halbrook, summoned but not yet welcomed into the centre of the scene. Behind him, almost filling the doorway, the Duke arrived and stopped. "Ah," Lady Neilson said brightly, "our principles are complete." Margaret crossed to the centre of the rug and stood still. "You requested a clarification, madam." "Indeed, of certain misunderstandings regarding your activities and His Grace's generosity." Alistair took one step forward. "This ends now." Lady Neilson turned her smile on him. "Does it? Then perhaps your household should hear what ends." She lifted the child's page between two fingers. "A governess writes secret letters to a dead duchess, hides them in unused rooms, and cultivates dependence from impressionable children. The Duke, overcome with gratitude, forgets propriety. I, as a concerned relation, intervene, and am threatened with legal force." Mrs. Fenwick inhaled softly. Lady Trowbridge shifted, hungry and horrified. Margaret did not look at the Duke. "You have one page, madam." "Read it in full." Lady Neilson blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You accuse me of manipulation. Read the letter you're holding, aloud." A beat. Then Lady Neilson laughed. "You do not dictate terms." "No," Margaret said. "Truth does." Lady Neilson's eyes flashed. "Very well." She unfolded the paper theatrically and read, voice coated in pity. "Mamma, I fell on the terrace and could not breathe, and Miss Neilson made me cough, and I hated it. Eliza cried, and I told her not to. Papa was wet and looked angry, but he was frightened, I think, though he said I was brave. I ate 2 puddings. Please do not be cross that I tore my coat." The room went very quiet. There was no seduction in it, no piety, just a boy, bruised and alive. Margaret let the silence settle, then spoke to the 2 ladies on the settee. "Mrs. Fenwick, Lady Trowbridge, you have both buried children in your families. It was true. Everyone knew it." "Did either of you call it indecent when the living spoke to the dead so they could sleep?" Lady Trowbridge's fan snapped once, shut. "No." Mrs. Fenwick cleared her throat. "Certainly not." Lady Neilson cut in sharper. "Tenderness is not at issue. Fraud is. The girl has played saint to gain position." "Then let us discuss fraud," Margaret said. She opened her father's ledger, flipped to marked pages, and held it steady in both hands. "You claimed promissory notes with His Grace's signature and impossible liabilities. Produce them." Lady Neilson's chin lifted. "Gladly." She withdrew several folded instruments from her packet and handed them not to Margaret but to Mrs. Fenwick, as if rank would validate paper. Mrs. Fenwick passed them, uneasy, to Halbrook. He read quickly, face tightening. 3 notes. 1 for 3,000, 1 for 1,200, 1 for 800. All purportedly signed by His Grace, payable to Lady Neilson or bearer. Alistair's voice was flat with contained fury. "I signed no such instruments." "Convenient," Lady Neilson murmured. Margaret extended her hand to Halbrook. "May I?" Halbrook hesitated, glanced once at the Duke, then gave her the papers. She laid them on the writing table beneath the lamp and bent over them. The room listened. "First," she said, tapping the top note, "date 12th October last year. Witnessed in London by Edwin Marsh." She looked up. "On 12th October His Grace was at Harrow publicly. Tenant rent remissions were signed that morning for the East Farms after flood damage. Mr. Halbrook?" Halbrook opened his case, pulled a ledger copy and found the page. "Confirmed. Harrow Estate Office, 10 a.m. through noon. I was present. Margaret nodded and moved to the second note. Date, 2nd November. States payment secured against the late Duchess's Hartwell Dowry Trust. That trust was dissolved into the children's settlements upon her death. She turned to Lady Neilson. No one can borrow against an extinguished instrument. Lady Neilson's smile thinned. You presume legal expertise beyond your station. My father balanced shipping accounts and land contracts for 20 years, Margaret said, without heat. I copied his legal shorthand before I was 16. She pointed to the witness line. Same witness, Edwin Marsh, signs this second note with a flourish under the E. On the first note, he omits it. On the third, he spells his own surname March. Either Mr. Marsh forgot himself 3 times, or one hand invented 3 men. A stir from the settee. Lady Trowbridge leaned forward. Margaret lifted the final paper. Third note, dated 15th December, at Harrow House. Mentions debt for stabling and bay gelding acquisition. The Harrow Stables ledger, she looked to Halbrook again, records no bay gelding purchase in December, only in April from Mr. Pritchard at Lewes. Halbrook checked, nodded once. Correct. Lady Neilson's colour rose. Clerical variance proves nothing. Margaret set down the note and very carefully pulled from her ledger a sheet of translucent copying paper on which she had traced genuine signatures that afternoon. I compared these with 6 authentic signatures by His Grace. In true signatures, the downstroke of V and Vale cuts back, left at the base. On your notes, it curls right. The ink on these notes has copper sheen consistent with cheap commercial gall bought in town. His Grace signs with estate iron black, compounded on sight. And, she angled the paper toward the lamp, this one was sanded twice before folding. The first signature bled and was overwritten. You can see the ghosting. Even Mrs. Fenwick rose now and came nearer to peer. Lady Neilson's voice sharpened into a near hiss. Parlour tricks. No, Margaret said. Arithmetic. She turned a page in the ledger and faced the room fully. You demanded £5,000. The 3 notes total 5,000 exactly. Yet the lawful balance from my late father's estate to Lady Neilson, after auction proceeds and principal already paid by instalment, is £462 8 shillings. I have the figures. She handed Halbrook her copied columns, checked against her own receipts in her hand. Halbrook scanned, then looked up, startled despite himself. These totals are accurate. Lady Neilson laughed too loudly. How industrious! A pity industry does not confer credibility. At that, Margaret did what she had not planned to do. She took one step away from the desk and addressed the 2 ladies directly, voice clear enough to carry beyond the salon door. I was struck in the mouth this spring for refusing to beg a creditor. I was sent here as partial settlement, called temporary, and warned I could be forced into marriage if I failed to earn my keep. I remained because 2 children needed steadiness, and because this household was drowning politely. If that is ambition, then yes, I am ambitious for their safety. Footsteps halted outside the salon. Guests were listening now. Lady Neilson's eyes went hard with panic, then calculation. She shifted tactics in real time. Very moving, she said, but none of this explains the intimacy between governess and Duke. Shall we invite the company and ask how many evenings she spends in his study? How many private conferences? How quickly a widower forgets? Alistair moved at last, with visible heat. Take care. No, Your Grace, Lady Neilson snapped. You take care. You may silence servants, you may pension lawyers, but you cannot marry beneath scandal and call it virtue. The words hit the room like a dropped glass. Margaret felt the old instinct to shrink, plain, temporary, unprotected, rise and break. She turned to Halbrook. You are solicitor to this estate. In the hearing of witnesses, do these papers constitute attempted fraud? Halbrook drew himself up. On present evidence, yes. At minimum, uttering forged instruments, with intent to extort. Lady Nielsen spun toward him. You coward! I will ruin you in every county court. He did not flinch. Madame, you have already attempted to ruin yourself. She clutched the packet to her chest. You have no originals, no proof where these came from. Margaret met her gaze. No, but you carried Theo's letter in your reticule like a weapon. You threatened release packets if asked to leave. Name your depositories. Lady Nielsen smiled, brittle now. Make me. For the first time, Margaret smiled back, small, precise, merciless. I already did. She lifted a second folded note from her sleeve, one she had written in legal shorthand and sent by kitchen boy an hour before the musical began. Mr. Halbrook had your maid, Denise, questioned with the promise of immunity from your gambling debts if she spoke truthfully. She spoke. Mrs. Davenant's packet was collected at 4:30 under your own written instruction. The banker's clerk surrendered his unopened copy when shown your forged witness inconsistencies. Both are in Mr. Halbrook's case. Halbrook, grim, opened the leather case and laid 2 sealed packets on the table. Lady Nielsen stared at them as if they were snakes. Silence broke into whispers in the corridor beyond. Someone gasped outright. Lady Nielsen's composure cracked. Lies! All lies! She forged those to frame me, Margaret said very quietly. Your hand blots the loop of your N whenever you are hurried. It appears in every threat you wrote me. It appears on the packet orders. You taught me that blot when you made me copy invitations as a girl. Lady Nielsen's mouth opened, then shut. For one naked second, she looked less like a society matron than a gambler watching the final card turn against her. Then she lunged for the nearest packet, perhaps to tear, perhaps to swallow evidence whole. Halbrook caught her wrist. The papers fell. Unhand me! She screamed. You cannot touch me! Alistair's voice cut through, no longer cold but blazing. Mrs. Finch, he called toward the door. Send for 2 footmen. Lady Nielsen will be shown to her rooms under watch. Lady Nielsen twisted toward him, hairpins loosening. You would arrest your own kin for this drab little thing? For fraud, he said, for blackmail, for threatening my children. He stepped closer, each word deliberate. And for mistaking my restraint for weakness. She spat at his boots. No one moved to defend her. When the footman came, she fought like a trapped animal, accusing, weeping, cursing, bargaining within one breath. She demanded carriages, then mercy, then money. She named names, secrets, old flirtations, as if detonating every room might still create escape. By the time they got her to the hallway, half the musical guests had witnessed enough to feed 3 counties of gossip. At the threshold, she wrenched free one final time and pointed at Margaret. You think you've won. You are still nothing without his favour. Margaret stood straight, ink on her fingers, father's ledger against her palm. No, she said, I am something even without it. That is why this failed. Lady Nielsen made a sound like a laugh broken in half, then was taken away. In the sudden hush, the violin in the music room began anyway, trembling and brave. No one returned at once to sonatas. The salon became an impromptu tribunal of rank, propriety, and damage control. Mrs. Fenwick insisted on written statements before memory is diluted by emotion. Lady Trowbridge, unexpectedly practical, sent her maid to fetch her husband, a magistrate, from the card room next door. Halbrook sealed the forged notes, and both recovered packets with wax from the Duke's desk, and had witnesses sign across the folds, Lady Nielsen from upstairs shouted intermittently for nearly 20 minutes, then descended into sobbing fury, audible through the floorboards. She was not done fighting. When the magistrate arrived, ruddy, irritated at being pulled from whist, she reinvented herself in an instant. By the time he entered her room, she was pale, reclining, smelling salts at hand, voice barely above a whisper. "I am unwell," she breathed. "This is persecution. They have trapped me with documents I do not understand." Margaret, summoned as complainant, watched from the doorway while Halbrook presented evidence. Lady Nielsen shifted tears into outrage seamlessly. "That girl has always hated me," she said, pointing weakly at Margaret. "She covets position. She manipulates his grace and now scripts legal theatre." The magistrate glanced at Margaret with the weary scepticism reserved for lower-born women near high-born trouble. "Miss Nielsen," he said, "did you see Lady Nielsen forge these notes with your own eyes?" "No," Margaret answered. Lady Nielsen smiled through tears. Margaret continued, "But I can prove she possessed false instruments, threatened release of private materials for payment, and lied about debt amounts." "Circumstantial," the magistrate muttered. "Then let us strengthen it." Margaret asked permission to question Lady Nielsen directly. The magistrate frowned, then shrugged. Lady Nielsen dabbed her eyes, triumphant. "By all means." Margaret took one step in. "Madam, on Tuesday you told me you held notes signed in grief when men are careless. Correct?" "I said many things in concern." "Did you or did you not state the amount demanded was £5,000? "I may have repeated figures shown to me by advisers." "Name them." "I decline." "Because there are none." Margaret turned to the magistrate. "Please request her account book." Lady Nielsen stiffened. "My private accounts are irrelevant." "They are relevant to motive," Margaret said. "If she truly believed 5,000 owed, it appears as receivable. If extorting, it appears nowhere." The magistrate, now mildly interested, ordered the account book produced from Lady Nielsen's travelling desk. She protested, then relented with a martyr's sigh. Margaret flipped to recent pages. Cards losses, dressmaker arrears. Payment to E. Marsh twice in small sums. She held up the book. "Edwin Marsh. The witness name on all 3 forged notes." Halbrook leaned in. "No gentleman witness takes hush payments of 4 guineas marked for hand." Lady Nielsen's mask slipped. "That notation means handwriting samples for invitations." Margaret turned another page and found pressed between leaves a practice sheet of signatures. A. Vale, Alistair Vale, repeated in different inks. The magistrate swore softly. Lady Nielsen saw their faces and made one last desperate pivot, rage replacing tears. "Yes, I practised," she snapped, "because men like you notice signatures and not suffering. I was owed for years of management while fools drank claret and called me extravagant. Owed for raising her after her father died to leave us with nothing but morals." Margaret went very still. "You raised me," she said. "You sold my mother's brooches for cards. You offered me to Calthorpe to postpone a note." Lady Nielsen's nostrils flared. "You ungrateful little prig! I gave you consequence." "You gave me fear," Margaret said. "I returned it." The room held that exchange like a struck bell. The magistrate straightened. "Lady Nielsen, you will surrender all financial papers for review and remain under supervised residence pending formal complaint. Given your health," his tone made clear what he thought of it, "you may travel tomorrow to Bath under escort rather than be lodged in town tonight, provided you sign recognition and forfeit independent access to funds until hearing." Lady Nielsen stared at him. "You cannot, and I can." She looked to Alistair, hoping perhaps for family mercy. He gave none. "Settle only lawful debt," he told Holbrook. "Not a shilling beyond." She turned to Margaret again, but whatever curse she intended curdled on her tongue when she saw no fear left to feed on. When they led Lady Neilson away for the second and final time, she did not fight. She walked stiff-backed, silk wrinkled, dignity torn, but still clutched in white knuckles, the last thing she owned. Downstairs the music-hall resumed in fragments. A sonata, then tea poured too loudly. Then carriages called earlier than planned. Guests departed with eyes bright from scandal and something like chastened respect. At the foot of the grand stair, as the last of the magistrate's papers were signed, Alistair turned to the remaining company, Mrs. Fenwick, Lady Trowbridge, Halbrook, 2 neighbouring landowners still lingering, and spoke without flourish. "Miss Margaret Neilson acted today with courage and exactitude that preserved my household and my children from grave harm. Any suggestion against her honour is false. If society requires further proof of my regard, it shall have it openly." He looked at Margaret, not away. "I intend," he said clearly, "to court her, publicly, with respect." The words seemed to startle even him by their simplicity, but he did not retreat from them. Lady Trowbridge gave a slow, almost approving nod. Mrs. Fenwick pressed Margaret's hand once, hard. Halbrook cleared his throat and pretended to study his seal. Margaret felt heat flood her face, then steadiness return. She bowed her head, not in submission, but acknowledgement. The world had tilted. It had not fallen. When the last carriage lamp vanished down the drive and Harrow House exhaled into midnight, Margaret found herself in the schoolroom doorway, unable, for a moment, to step inside. The room was exactly as she had left it. Copybooks stacked, candle wax on the brass holder, faint chalk dust in the grain of the table. Yet her body still rang with confrontation. The pulse in her wrists, the dry ache in her throat, the delayed shaking now that no one required her composure. Mrs. Finch appeared carrying a tray she had clearly bullied from an exhausted kitchen, tea gone strong, bread, cold chicken, and a wedge of plum tart. "You look like you'll either faint or bite someone," Mrs. Finch said. "Do one after you eat." Margaret laughed once, raggedly, and sat. Mrs. Finch poured tea. Theo and Eliza heard more than they should. Theo tried to come down with the poker. Eliza cried because she couldn't find the right shoes for battle. "I told them you had instructed retreat." "Thank you." Mrs. Finch hesitated, then asked softly, "Are you frightened now it's done?" Margaret wrapped both hands around the cup. "Yes, and relieved, and tired enough to sleep for a century. A sensible blend." They sat in companionable silence until small feet pattered in the corridor. Theo burst in barefoot, hair wild, Eliza on his heels clutching her rabbit by one ear. "You were shying," Theo accused, then corrected himself with that painful dignity. "Adults were shouting, 'Are we ruined?'" Margaret set down her cup and opened her arms. They collided into her, all elbows and night linen and trembling bravery. "No," she said into Theo's hair, "we are not ruined." Eliza pulled back first, searching Margaret's face. "Is Grandmama," she used the title with obvious reluctance, "gone?" "Yes." "Forever?" Margaret chose honesty. "She will not live here again." Theo looked past Margaret toward the corridor where his father now stood, silent in shirt-sleeves watching. "Papa," Theo said, still holding Margaret's sleeve, "did we win?" Alistair came into the room slowly, as if entering sacred ground he had once avoided. "We did," he said, "because Miss Neilson was braver than all of us." Theo considered this, then nodded as if confirming a military dispatch. Eliza, practical as ever, climbed onto the bench and opened the blue box. Then we must write it down before we forget and make it wrong later. Margaret felt her eyes sting. They wrote by one candle, all 4 of them in the cramped schoolroom, Theo pressing too hard, Eliza dotting E's with furious precision, Margaret smoothing the page edges, Alistair standing at first, then sitting when Theo shoved paper toward him. "Write 1 line," Theo ordered. "You have to. It's law." Alistair held the pen awkwardly, like a man handling an instrument from another life. Then he wrote slowly, "Tonight we chose noise over fear." He set the pen down. Margaret met his gaze across the table and saw no mask, only exhaustion and an unfamiliar tenderness threaded with awe. After the children were back in bed and finally asleep, the corridor outside the nursery was cool and hushed. The household had collapsed into pockets of whisper and recovery. Margaret gathered her shawl, meaning to go at last to her room, when Alistair said quietly, "Would you walk a moment?" They went to the gallery overlooking the east terrace, moonlight silvering the stone where Theo had fallen months ago. For a while they stood without speaking. At last he said, "I spoke publicly tonight without asking your leave." "Yes. Was that an imposition?" Margaret considered. "It was a risk. To you, to both of us." She turned to face him. "Why did you do it there, in that room?" His answer came rough and unadorned. "Because hiding has harmed everyone I love. Because if I left you to carry the stain alone while I managed matters politely, I would be a coward in a finer coat. Because when she called you nothing, I wanted the world corrected at once." Her breath caught. He looked down at his hands, then back at her with the raw steadiness of a man choosing truth over control. "I loved my wife," he said. "I still do, in the way the dead remain part of the architecture of one's life. I thought that meant any new feeling was disloyalty or hunger. Then you arrived and did what no one else dared. You saw my children clearly, and me less kindly than I wanted, but more accurately than I deserved. I began to rely on your judgment, then your presence, then your voice in rooms where I could not hear myself think without it." He swallowed. "I am in love with you, Margaret, not because you mended us, not because you are convenient to grief, because you are yourself, and because when you are absent the house narrows." The gallery seemed to tilt gently under her feet. She had imagined this moment in guarded flashes and dismissed each as dangerous fantasy. The reality was quieter and far more frightening. "I have loved you in pieces," she said softly, "in the way you stood at Theo's bedside pretending not to shake, in the way you listened tonight when listening cost pride, in the way you can be cruel by accident, but never by design." A brief, wry breath. "And yes, in the way you look at maps as if borders are personal insults." A laugh escaped him, startled and grateful. Then she grew serious. "But love is not enough if I step from one dependency into another story people tell about me. I won't be your hidden comfort. I won't be your scandal. If we do this, we do it in daylight." "In daylight," he agreed immediately. "I need work that is mine in this house, not charity and lace." "You shall have it. Name it." She thought of ledgers, letters, the morning room where she had first stood bleeding and temporary. "Estate correspondence," she said. "Tenant petitions, remissions, legal drafts, household circulars, formal appointment. Salary." His mouth curved, not mocking. "You bargain even in declarations?" "I survive in them." "Done," he sobered. "And courtship, if you permit it." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "Courtship." Relief crossed his face so nakedly it made her chest ache. He did not reach for her immediately. He asked very quietly, "May I kiss you?" "Yes." When he kissed her, it was not possession but promise, careful at first, then certain. his hand warm at her jaw where months ago bruises had bloomed. She leaned into him, tasting rainless night and tea and the strange sweetness of being chosen openly. When they parted, he rested his forehead briefly against hers. "Tomorrow will be loud," he murmured. "I know." "Will you stand it with me?" She smiled, tired and fierce. "Only if you don't do it the bad way." He blinked, then laughed softly as Theo would have wanted. "Noise over fear, then. Noise over fear." The next morning, Noise arrived precisely at 9. In the morning room, the same room where Margaret had first stood with blood in her mouth, the steward read aloud the Duke's formal notice of appointment while Halbrook witnessed, and Mrs. Finch stood like a compact army at Margaret's shoulder. "Miss Margaret Neilson is hereby engaged as correspondence secretary to the Harrow estate," the steward intoned, clearly savouring each improbable syllable, "with authority to draft and manage tenant communications, educational accounts, and household memoranda subject to His Grace's review." Margaret signed. Her hand did not shake. Then Alistair signed beneath hers and slid the paper to Halbrook. "Salary quarterly," he said. "Separate account in her own name." Mrs. Finch made a small, approving noise that might have been a sniff. Before luncheon, cards began to arrive from neighbouring houses. Not all kind, not all cruel, most curious. By 4 o'clock, Lady Trowbridge called in person, sat very straight on the edge of a chair, and asked Margaret whether she would be willing to advise on a small confusion in her late brother's trust records. By 6, Mrs. Fenwick sent flowers and a note. "If anyone repeats nonsense, send them to me. I have sharper elbows than most." 3 days later, Lady Neilson departed under escort for Bath, pale and silent, with restricted funds administered through Halbrook pending court review. As her carriage rolled away, she looked once toward an upper nursery window. Theo, beside Margaret, raised his hand, not in farewell exactly, but in acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. That same afternoon, Halbrook arrived from town with one additional packet tied in plain twine. "For completeness," he said, placing it before Margaret and the Duke in the correspondence room. "Notice served this morning upon Mr. Calthorpe through his solicitors. Any purported claim on Miss Neilson's person, settlement, or hand in marriage, whether framed as debt security or private understanding, is void and unenforceable. He is warned that further pressure will be treated as participation in extortion." Margaret broke the seal and read the final line twice before breathing. Alistair held out his hand. She gave him the paper. He read jaw tight, then passed it back to Halbrook. "And his response?" "Filed within the hour," Halbrook said. "Mr. Calthorpe withdraws his offer entirely and disclaims any existing engagement before Michaelmas or thereafter. He will not contest." The room went very still, then easier. "Thank you," Margaret said. Halbrook inclined his head. "That thread is cut." In the weeks that followed, courtship did not hide. Alistair called in the small drawing-room at proper hours with doors open and at least one outrageous floral arrangement sent by amused allies. They walked with the children on the south lawn while gardeners pretended not to eavesdrop. At dinners in neighbouring houses, he asked Margaret's opinion before speaking his own, and watched half the table recalculate the social map in real time. One wet afternoon in October, he arrived in the correspondence office, once a storage room, now Margaret's domain of pigeonholes and sealing wax, and set down a stack of invitations. "Lady Ashcombe has invited us both to supper," he said. Margaret looked up from tenant petitions. "As what?" "As ourselves," he said, "which appears to alarm her and delight me." She laughed and handed him a draft letter. "Then initial this remission, and you may enjoy your alarm." By winter whisper had dulled into habit. Harrow House was not transformed by miracle. It was altered by repetition. doors left open, names spoken, grief admitted without ceremony. The late Duchess's portrait was no longer veiled at dinner. Eliza resumed scales and no longer apologised for laughter. Theo still argued with Latin, but slept through most storms. In March, under a pale, clean sky, Margaret and Alistair stood in the parish church where Helena Vale was buried beneath yew shade and stone. There was no attempt to erase what had been. A small white posy lay on Helena's grave before the service, placed there by Alistair at dawn, and joined by 2 crooked snowdrops from Eliza's fist. Inside, vows were said simply. Margaret's dress was ivory wool, elegant and unshowy. Theo held himself like a guardsman and forgot the ring cushion twice. Eliza cried at the hymn, then denied it ferociously. When it was done and the register signed, Alistair bent and whispered at Margaret's ear, "You are no longer temporary." She answered, smiling through tears she did not hide, "Neither are you." Years later, on a mild evening in early summer, the Duke, still Alistair at home, Silver now fully established at his temples, went looking for a dispatch and found instead the blue box on Margaret's writing desk. The correspondence office had grown into a true heart of the house. Maps pinned straight, shelves of tenant files, children's old copybooks saved for sentiment despite all vows of practicality. From the garden below came distant laughter. Theo home from university, arguing strategy with his younger cousins, Eliza correcting everyone. Alistair lifted the box lid with the reverence one learns for objects that have carried whole lives. Inside were decades of letters, childish blocks becoming adult script, pages from illnesses survived and harvests failed, and Christmases too loud to be dignified. Near the top lay a newer page in Margaret's hand. Today, His Grace burned the fish at luncheon because he insisted he could manage a simple pan. He ate it anyway and called it character building. Progress remains measurable. Alistair laughed aloud. Margaret appeared in the doorway, spectacles low on her nose, ink smudged at her thumb exactly as on the night everything changed. "You found my evidence?" she said. "Your indictments," he corrected, holding up the fish letter. She came beside him and looked into the box. "I keep thinking I'll stop. Then someone says something worth recording." He reached for another sheet and found one in his own hand, written only last month. Eliza played her mother's sonata and did not cry until the final bar. I cried first, quietly, and was discovered immediately. Margaret pretended not to notice until later, then handed me a handkerchief and called me dramatic. She was right. He read it, then looked at her. "My letters are improving," he said. She smiled, eyes warm. "They are kinder." He set the page back in the box, closed the lid, and took her ink-stained hand to his mouth. Outside, thunder muttered far off over the downs. Inside, no one went quiet.